Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to our first ever live stream. This is Code Talk, the first of a new monthly series hosted by CODE-CWA, where workers and organizers in the tech industry study and explore the historical, economic, and political context in which we struggle. Tonight, we're hosting a Q&A with Rob Larson, who is the author of Tyrants, The Political Economy of Silicon Valley. And we'll be talking about all the shady business that the big five tech companies, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and Apple, have been up to over the last couple decades. Tonight will be a two-part Q&A. The first will be a moderated Q&A between myself, Wes, my fellow campaign lead at CODE-CWA, and Rob, our guest. During the second part of the Q&A, we will open up to the audience for questions. So for anyone who RSVP'd to the event, please feel free to check your emails for a link to the form through which you can submit your questions for Rob. And please feel free to send in multiple questions, and at any point throughout the event, we'll be watching it the whole time. All right, so let's get to it. Wes, would you mind maybe coming on and introducing yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Emma. My name is Wes McEnany, campaign co-lead with CODE-CWA with Emma, and I live in Boston. My pronouns are he, him.
Awesome. Cool. Rob, do you want to come on?
Evening.
Cool. You want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Oh, yeah, sure. Rob Larson, professor of economics, author of Tyrants and other stuff.
Okay, awesome. Cool. Thank you for coming on. We really appreciate it. And I know a lot of people are really, really excited to see this. So I guess we'll just get started right off and start talking about it. First off, can you give us maybe like a brief little overview and summary of the book, what it's about, why you wrote it?
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, it's good to be here with y'all tonight. It's kind of weird talking through these media, but we're all getting used to it. I still get ready the same way I always do. I look at a light bulb, a mirror surrounded by light bulbs, and I go, it's showtime. And that helps me to prepare. So good to see you all, sort of, those of you I can see. So what we're going to talk about tonight is the big tech platforms and where they come from and ways that we can change the way that they operate and organize within them. And there's a lot to say about it. I mean, maybe the best way to get into it is just to point out one thing. Like right now, the 5 biggest companies in America and the world right now are the 5 big tech platforms. Like Emma said, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook, just those 5. They are the 5 largest firms in the world. That's just unusual historically. Like when I was a younger person back in the 90s, at that point, the biggest firms would be like Exxon, Walmart, Chase Bank, Berkshire Hathaway, something like that. It's unusual for them to all be from one sector, the tech sector, obviously. And these firms are getting even more enormous just lately, of course. Well, there's some reasons why those firms end up being so absurdly large, why they're dominating the list of the biggest firms. And it does involve economics, but it's going to be all right. Just comfort yourselves for a moment and we'll try to make it not too bad. So one thing that we see in a lot of markets for goods and services is there's different patterns in terms of how they behave over time based on like what the product or service is. And with these kind of markets, we tend to see is that the services are mediated through networks, that connect different users or different producers. And that tends to have some pretty big economic ramifications for how those markets behave. So network effects, essentially what that means, the small version, is that when someone else starts using a product, its value to you gets bigger, which isn't usually the case, in most markets, like for sandwiches, or if you buy a pair of pants, okay, they're comfortable. If I buy a pair of similar pants, like that doesn't make your pants any more valuable. They're just unrelated transactions. On the other hand, if you're on, a network like Instagram or Facebook, and I start a Facebook or Instagram account, that makes your access to that platform a little more useful because there's one more party who might view your posts or make a post that you would enjoy. And that's just a basic aspect of markets that are mediated through networks, Phone services like that too. If you're the first person to have a phone, Great, call yourself, it's not that handy. As soon as a number of other people and businesses start connecting to a phone network, well, now that phone on your wall, or these days in your pocket, gets bigger because there's increasing numbers of parties that you can reach and transact with. It's just the weird nature of these markets. So the thing about these network effects mediated markets is they tend to be more prone to monopoly and big concentration of businesses, even more than other markets are. And it's common enough in the rest of capitalism. Before we had some limits on monopoly in the US, Rockefeller had his Standard Oil monopoly, Carnegie and Steel, cigarette monopolies, appliances, pretty extensive. But these markets are especially prone to this sort of issue because of that network aspect. And where you tend to end up in markets that have this network phenomenon is with what we call platforms. And everyone, of course, in the industry is familiar with that basic term. Platform just means some central hub, the value of which comes from bringing together different users, and often users or producers of different kinds of content. So I like YouTube as an example. YouTube grew early on because it was an easy, very convenient place for people to upload their online video. Well, all that video attracted an audience. As that audience gets bigger, it attracts more video makers, and that richer video library attracts a bigger audience. And you get to the point where we are today, where every day, 65 years of video content is uploaded to YouTube. So your homework is to think about that until you go mad. It won't take that long. So that's what platforms are. And they have lots of interesting, unique characteristics. What's most relevant for us is that platform firms become phenomenally powerful. For one thing, they make huge amounts of money because they tend to be monopolies, single companies that dominate markets, or sometimes oligopolies. That's where you've got 2 or 3 giant firms that dominate, like the 3 cell phone carriers or the 2 companies that make operating systems to run our smartphones on. So these firms end up being pretty gigantically powerful. And of course, because these firms obviously operate in information-based markets, they have a lot of power to filter or just influence up or down what people hear about, what search results they get, what videos they see, what social media posts they're going to encounter. So regardless of exactly what you think of them company by company, you can't really deny that their power is incredible, more than other powerful companies even, because of the importance of information and because of how concentrated these markets tend to get. And the book, I spend probably the majority of the book looking at examples of how powerful these firms are. There's lots of examples. Look at like Amazon, which has a network effect because, as you may know, the majority of the firm's sales come from those third-party merchants, independent sellers of goods. Well, because they're attracted to the big market that Amazon created, that attracts more shoppers, that attracts more of those third-party retailers. It's a common positive feedback technique or a pattern that we see there. Well, Amazon uses that power to crush competitors. And we just stick with the original sector for them, which was books. People forget Amazon started with books, but it's true. And back in those earlier days, they would find, when the company was getting big, they would find small publishers with very thin profit margins, and they would target them and say, you're going to give us a lower price on the books that we sell from you, or we're not going to put you in our recommendations algorithm anymore, which is enough to destroy small book publishers. Well, internally, Amazon, they called that Operation Gazelle, because it's all about finding the weak, sickly, or young gazelles like leopards and tigers do. You target the weakest ones opportunistically because you're like an evil predator. An example of Amazon's power, Google has them too, to pick the company with the nicer reputation. Google may come out of academia, but as soon as it became, once it was created in 1998, it's a private market firm, And so they have a record of, for example, as they developed a lot of search traffic from like comparison shopping, like choosing different prices for, plane tickets or washing machines or whatever, other competitors started arising, independent websites that would do this price comparison feature, and they would do very well on Google's rankings. And then suddenly they would be on page 15 of Google's rankings when Google eventually realized that they were horning in on their market segment. And we even have company founder Larry Page on this from very friendly corporate biographies written mostly by business journalists like from Fortune and Wall Street Journal and stuff. And Page said, we thought products should get more exposure, meaning Google's comparison shopping products should get more exposure, so downrank that competitor, even though supposedly it's this totally neutral algorithm based on the mathematical coding of it. So the power of these firms is very real. So what's relevant for us, I would say, is the issue of what the workforce can do, because historically a major role. I mean, the labor movement's had a number of functions and contributions that it's made. But I think maybe the easiest way to see how important it is for us is if you look at these big five platform companies, to a point, they still kind of have their, not cutthroat, not quite as commercially profit obsessed. They have a sort of nicer reputation. But if you look at it, most of the things they have that reputation from are workforce actions by the people working at the company. And that could be those big walkouts, those big walkouts that Google had once the workforce found out that Andy Rubin, one of the creators of the Android operating system that Google now owns, that runs most of the world's smartphones. He had a very credible couple of sexual assault and harassment allegations in the workplace, and they let him go with the typical gigantic golden parachute of a couple $1 million, much more than any of us will make in our human lifespans. But this guy who has these credible sex harassment allegations, well, you will receive millions of dollars. We can't give those to people sheltering from a virus. We got plenty of money to give it to kind of corporate scumbags who years ago made an important contribution to the firm, But a walkout there, that's not coming from Google's management. They're the ones who gave them the parachute. It's the workforce, the coders and the engineers and the rank and file staff working for that gigantic firm who deserve the credit there. And also there's, for example, a lot of opposition to Google engineers and others like at Microsoft building AI for the Pentagon to make drones to blow up people in Yemen for no reason. Like the walkouts and opposition and petitioning and extensive organizing against that, it's the workforce, it's not so much management. They're the ones who would like to move forward with these kind of things. And just lately, even Amazon's having walkouts, like Amazon, which kind of has the most notorious labor record and is the most invested in anti-union fighting, labor organizing resources. They're having walkouts because the workers are recognizing that they are nowhere near adequately protected against COVID-19 in the workplace. And now Amazon, these are like frontline workers now. So many people are relying on them because brick and mortar retail is shut down in most of the country and world right now. And a lot of people are just scared to go out in the first place. But these actions are coming from the workforce. And that speaks to something really important about the labor movement that it's achieved in other industries and that we hope can happen in tech as well. As it gives workers like a countervailing power center. Like these companies have a long record of saying, we have shared governance, you workers can come to us, your creativity is our strength. Up to a point, but now your creativity makes you not want to develop drone software. So now we're going to try to push you aside a little bit. You need an enduring separate center where you as the workers who create all the software and all these fancy algorithms, which I am nowhere near understanding. Now, I'm an economist, I'm not a computer scientist person, but clearly like that's the heart of the value at these firms, and these companies file quarterly and annual reports with the SEC, with the government explaining how they operate and where their power centers and profit centers are. And it's all coming from the algorithm and the coding that y'all in tech are doing and that you're responsible for. So I think it just makes sense just on those grounds alone to consider having a real independent bargaining unit or another form of collective representation that gives you just some independent pull against management, which will retain, control over the firm and over the platform and its decisions. I would just hope that that's something we could have. So these companies, these tiny numbers of executive officers and the firms and their boards, they held so much influence over the information that we see. And this is an election year with a crazy health crisis going on. It's arguably too much power to be just in the hands of those CEOs and division managers at these firms. So there's that aspect. But another aspect too is something that we talk about in the labor movement since its existence, which is solidarity. Okay, after all, so many, like the majority of the workforces for most of these big tech firms, Microsoft and Google, majority of them are your white collar workforce, people who have extensive training and experience and education so they can write code and design platforms and all the technical headaches that come from running trillion-dollar corporations like we're talking about. That's the majority of the staff, is that white collar workforce. And the hours y'all put in are bonkers already. But we should recognize that it's not just Amazon that has a big like blue collar or as it were working class segment of its workforce in the fulfillment centers, but Google and Facebook have large blue collar segments of their workforce, mostly independent contractors. And the main area they're working, of course, is content moderation. Because as we learned over the last several years, these companies during their growth periods, fueled by the network effects, which is just gasoline on a fire of growth, that period, is where these firms are growing so much, we now know that they had no interest in curating their platforms and keeping an eye of what was on it or dealing with things like that. So as a result, we have all the interference that people are so concerned about, like on platforms like Facebook in 2016 in the last election, or on YouTube, which kind of became notorious for a while for just after a click or two, steering you toward crazy niche right-wing fringe opinion on vaccines to the moon landing to everything else. And it's because YouTube is built to keep you on the site, whereas Google search is for successful search. They want to move you on quickly. YouTube is the opposite. The economics are kind of interesting. We can come back to that. But those platforms now are sort of curated, but it's by this contracted, independent workforce. These people, of course, have no job security, broadly speaking. They have terrible work hours. And of course, it's the worst job you can imagine. I mean, if you're a nurse working right now, it's hellish in a lot of the world right now, but at least you know what's happening when you go in. Like these content moderators, I mean, spare a moment to think about what they go through every day on the clock. They're seeing the worst things that people in the world do and put on the internet. So it's sexual abuse, full-on murders, mass shootings, animal abuse, war crimes, like the worst stuff. And if you read the accounts of these workers and where they talk about their work conditions, you've got 7-8 seconds per flagged item that some user has flagged from YouTube or whatever. And you've got a few seconds to look at it, behold the bottomless depths of horror, choose which sanction level it deserves, and you choose that, and now you're watching a new atrocity, and then 8 hours has gone by, and you get a tiny paycheck, and you wish you still had some of your humanity, Well, the thing about having union organizing or some form of labor organizing on the platforms is it would mean that the workers who are, as it were, more privileged, who are white collar, work with your education, work in a comfortable office environment, have all the famous Silicon Valley perks they talk about. You can show solidarity with these workers who have much worse experiences of the platforms than the white collar workers and certainly us platform users do, and get them some job security or better pay or just a slightly less relentlessly grueling work rhythm. That's something that is totally within the power of the more privileged and more technologically sophisticated branch of the workforce. You can leverage the power you have with those firms to support these people. And that's the thing. We tend to valorize these giant trillion-dollar companies. It's largely the workforce that runs the firm and makes it work, of course, but also the ones who are taking what steps that are positive at these firms right now and leading these walkouts and looking at things like solidarity moves with these much less favorably positioned workers would be beneficial. And other aspects too, like a historical demand of the labor movement has been what they used to call open the books. So companies say you can't pay people more than this, or you can't change their platform in this way. Well, we're just taking your word for it. An old labor movement demand was open the books. Maybe you're telling the truth. Let's just see. And management, of course, has never had any interest in doing that, But these are some of the benefits that can accompany different methods and different vehicles for worker organizing at different kinds of firms and certainly at the platforms, And maybe the last thing we should just refer to is with the virus happening now. I mean, but when I wrote this book, I started writing it 3 years ago. It takes a while to research an industry and put out writing on it. Back then, I picked the industry to talk about because we were already so reliant on it. I mean, I don't have to tell you, everyone knows how reliant we are with our phones. Sometimes when you leave your phone at home or it breaks or it has a problem, you realize like, I can't. Oh. Like it's a major loss when your phone doesn't work or when you break it, or if you try to put it aside for a week. Try it. It's not as easy as it sounds, So we were pretty reliant on these firms in the first place to find jobs, to search for information, to date, for God's sake, pretty reliant. But now with the COVID-19, a large part of the workforce, the luckier part of the workforce, we're hunkered down at home and we're more reliant on these platforms than ever. YouTube and Facebook are having huge increase in the hours and the engagement rates because, of course, people are at home. At least you can call your friends or watch something or get into a podcast or a video channel, which is great, but it only increases how much we rely on these guys. And that includes Microsoft and Amazon, of course, because those are the two biggest vendors for cloud computing. And all of our video and goofy cat pictures and so on have to be posted somewhere. And that's usually in one of the forms, of cloud computing through the data centers, So these firms' influence is only growing. I mean, just recently, Andrew Cuomo, the New York governor, who everyone's so delighted with among the Democrats. And I can see him replacing Biden on the top of the ticket since he's a walking corpse himself. So you take a look at Cuomo, he's your classic modern Democrat. He was just saying we should put Bill Gates and his foundation more in charge of education in the state, and said, why do we have this model of teachers and classrooms with all the technology we have? As an educator, let me just say in this moment, there is value to the classroom environment. People really are more present when they're there with their fellow students and with the person in the room. It is a different experience, So right now there's proposals just for us to be more reliant on them than ever before. And so instead of maybe valorizing the companies, we should be looking at the workforce who creates all this value and who could show solidarity with their fellow workers. And then we could talk about putting some limits on tech, as it is. Whenever we update your operating system on your phone or get a new game or app on it, we've all seen there's a terms and conditions, a terms of services agreement, and no one reads it. I don't read them, and I'm an economist. I don't read it because you're looking at many pages of technical legalese. If you read it, you won't understand a lot of it. And every app and every piece of technology we use has one of these things. We have limited human lifespans. We don't have time to be spending hours a day reading corporate terms of service that change without notice and are hard to understand. If we looked at maybe having a richer form of workplace democracy, maybe moving beyond a simple worker representation, a bargaining unit, we could talk about having more worker control over these platforms. And we talk about worker control. That means you go into work, you have access to the information that management, as it is, keeps to itself to make decisions. And you and your coworkers, through some process that you would have to work out, it probably takes some doing, you figure out a process where you work together to make the decisions about what the platform's going to do. You'd have to work with representatives of other platforms that you articulate with. We all know about the crazy amount of interfacing and APIs that these different platforms have so they can speak to each other. So you'd have to have a lot of federation there. But that kind of worker control where we decide what the goddamn terms of service are, that's something that I think we should maybe think about striving toward as a positive goal, not just putting these companies in their place, which is good on its own terms, but something positive we can strive for. How about some democracy? We expect democracy up to a point in our political system. Why is our economic system immune to that? Why are we so used to going into work for our old or new economy employers and just expecting management to tell us what to do? I mean, of course, we're used to it, but I think we should maybe consider moving past that sort of thing. And so at the end of the book, I take a short look at how we could develop different forms of worker control or online socialism, as I like to say. And there's a lot to look at there, but that's sort of the overview.
Awesome. I really appreciate that. You were talking about kind of opening the books and kind of transparency about finances and how in traditional labor that's often been kind of a demand, right? Open the books and we'll see just how tight the budget is and see where all the money is going because it's not going to the workers, right? It really makes me think of an example where I'm organizing a group of contractors at a certain firm that contracts out for a larger tech company. And there's a really interesting dynamic where the workers themselves, the contract workers, most absolutely are struggling. They don't have a lot of great finances sometimes, but this group actually, felt relatively comfortable. They wanted to organize around some other issues, not just bread and butter wages and conditions. But we looked into the finances of the company and we were able to find out, through things falling off the back of a truck, that essentially there was a situation happening where these workers were making about $20 an hour, which is pretty good money. Like for the average US worker, that's way above where most people make. Of course, it doesn't match with like living costs and so on, but you won't even go there. But $20 is pretty good, right? $20 an hour. We found out that the company was getting paid $55 a person per hour by the contracting is paying people $22 an hour to do work that they receive $55 an hour for, just for the sake of being the middleman who's like whipping the workers, I guess, So is this real moment for the workers of like, oh my gosh, like we produce so much value. We produce actually all of the value in our company. And there's just a huge portion being siphoned away. And I think most people really don't understand just how big that cut that goes to the company, that goes to the executives, that goes to the shareholders really is. I think it's usually, I think we underestimate that. We think, oh, you got to pay for the building, the lighting, the internet costs and whatever. But there's a huge portion of money that's just getting vacuumed straight up to the top. So it was really interesting when you said that, because it reminded me exactly of this campaign I'm running, where they're kind of running into that exact same situation, even in 2020.
That's great. That's impressive. And it is true. I mean, these companies are, there's a reason why their stock prices, the price of owning a little piece of the companies. There's a reason why their stock prices are performing so well and why they can drag the whole NASDAQ back up, even during this goofy crisis that we're living through. And the reason is they're just fantastically profitable. Yes, white collar staff are expensive. You have to pay them modest six-figure salaries. That's real money. It's true. Or, significant per hourly rate like that. But if you look at the amount of money that these firms are making, and most of it is from being a platform, like it really is, for all of the important technology that goes into it. And who would deny the sophistication behind the consumer facing part of these firms? The fact is, like, platforms are glorified middlemen. I mean, Google is making fantastic money from YouTube, for example. And what does YouTube do? Well, it provides a very easy to use service for uploading video and for viewing it, and has to have huge data management capabilities because of, again, the volume, just the ocean of video content there. But once that platform's up and running, it's just a money printing machine. The amount of money is fantastic. So it's true. The tendency is to underestimate how profitable and how much money really is in the firm when they nickel and dime you on your healthcare exclusions and your co-insurance. It's easy to lose sight of that too. And also in general, like, managers at firms tend to be very, you deal with them one-on-one as a worker. They want to have a good relationship with you. Most of these people aren't evil people, but it is true behind that. It's easy to lose sight of the fact that firms don't tend to be super honest with their workforce in general. And there's a long history of that. I mean, again, we mentioned Google and the resistance among its workers and its coders for developing AI for its drones and other Pentagon destruction platforms, we could say. And it's what we found in the record, and this has been in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, was management at Google, which again is the one with the nice reputation, has this long record now of fully misleading the workers and circulating memos just among management saying, avoid using AI in any mention of Pentagon contracts. Yes, we're developing that, but no, we don't want it in the public sector. And above all, we don't want the workers to find out, above the ones who are siloed working on the project specifically. So there's usually a little bit more dishonesty than you might cynically imagine. So yeah, I would say like that is one of the great values of the labor movement, at least historically, is its historic demand to have more transparency in these firms. And I mean, who could argue against that? But if you don't have the collective bargaining power to force it out of management, I mean, they tend not to just want to do it.
Great. Thanks, Rob. I really appreciated that. I think that was really good. Something you touched on in the beginning, you're talking about the Amazon warehouse workers and some of the activity that they've been doing. What are some ways workers can sort of bridge the gap and bridge that divide between those blue collar workers in warehouses or in the cafes, say at Google, right, in the office buildings, and the more white collar workers, the software engineers that we've also seen, a lot of activity and activism and organizing with? What strategic points of unity do you just see between those two groups of workers that ultimately are working for the same firm and being impacted in similar ways?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have limited answers to that because that's a real thing. I mean, of course, if you get into these subjects and look at it, like in business literature and in management literatures, and we have whole university programs that are about how to manage big firms, there's a whole history of talking about how to keep workers in their lane is often how it's referred to. But really what it is keeping them from objecting to what the firm is doing or becoming a pain in the ass to management. So siloing workers and separating them off from one another is always one of the big things here. And some of these firms are resistant to that because they've found that means parts of the firm don't talk to each other and maybe products don't get developed, in coordination in a proper way. So there's limits to it. But when you're looking, as you were just saying, like at the difference between the white and blue collar workers, like that tends to be a whole other deal. Like Amazon, go back to them, like they have a very large white collar workforce running the cloud, running the sophisticated search algorithms on just the retail website, of course, and all the headaches that go into that. And they have this huge blue collar workforce, but they don't tend to even be, for example, co-located. You don't tend to have the huge data center and a fulfillment center. Like those are separate arms of the business, the retail arm and Amazon Web Services, the cloud arm of Amazon. So it's not always so easy. I mean, I always assumed that the main way people become worker organizers is by developing a smoking habit, because that's a great way that you can get outside of the work environment and you're standing around smoking, nothing to do but chat about how we're getting screwed over by the man. So, I mean, that's not so helpful anymore. I guess you could vape, that's possible. But that's something I don't have an easy answer to for like how you break that down. I mean, I would say though, there tend to be things you can do, especially again, if you're one of these white collar workers to a limited but significant extent. Workers, professional class workers of different types, your white collar workforce, they're privileged in the work environment. And often you may find you have access to different limited portions of employee roles or head counts and people that you work with, and that can allow you to reach out to them. But I can say this, like management and the firms, love or hate them, they aren't going to make it easy for you to reach out and talk to people and see how you have, shared problems. They actually cut our healthcare back too. They did that. You guys got that too, really, you. Like those are the conversations that you have once you start breaking outside of your individual work team or your division at a business. It's like those are not always easy conversations to have too. I mean, blue and white collar workers, I mean, that's famous how I think people overdraw the point, but it's well known, like the different cultural and just personal mannerisms that people have based on whether they went to a grad program or got their GED. But it's something that we have to work through. And I could say, I mean, just from my limited personal experience, I teach at the community college level for many years, and we have a real mix of blue and white collar people, both on the faculty and certainly in the student population. These people don't, someone who's blue collar still speaks the same fundamental language as you. Yeah, you have lots of class tells in terms of how you phrase things and the way you speak. But you can communicate. Like it is the thing that you can do. It shouldn't be something that people see as an obstacle. You have the shared interest of all working for Jeff Bezos or for the great group of investors that own Microsoft and Apple, these elite families who own that equity. You have a legitimate interest in organizing with them, not just to get a better share of the pie for your health program, although God knows that's legitimate, but for this organizing work and just helping people to see the scope of their shared interest. That's how you build up solidarity on the most basic level. How you do this in your workplace, y'all will know that better than me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you meant it as a joke with the comment about, worker organizers taking up smoking and that's how they get started. But like, I'll be honest, I've seen a lot of campaigns, it's actually really effective if there's like the group that goes to the bar or the group that goes smoking twice a day or the fighting club game group or something, not fight club, but the fighting game club, because we're talking about a lot of tech people and, that's the kind of thing we tend to do, it seems like on our lunch breaks. But, I think workplace mapping in that way, figuring out what those different social groups are is actually really crucial to understand what's the kind of social lifeblood and the connective tissue of the workforce. And, I've had a lot of success with organizers kind of, going to the smoking group or hanging out with the D&D group or, taking up like mechanical keyboard hobbying or whatever the case may be, as a way of like connecting to their coworkers in ways that are already kind of existence. So it was just funny that it was a joke, but it really reminds me of kind of some of the day-to-day of organizing.
I'm telling you, it really just is when you're on the clock. I mean, you've got work to do, whether you hate it because you're an Amazon worker being tracked by your picking device that you use to find merchandise, or if you're just a committed person who believes in making information available at Google or connecting people at Facebook, you're on the clock. It's when you get off the clock, you can actually have a conversation. And yeah, I'm telling you, smoking plays a big role in it. But hell, start with a Martini Tuesday with your favorite coworkers and be open to growing it out. I mean, I bet we'd be surprised if we could learn how many strike waves started off with, let's go down to the pub, it's Wednesday or whatever. A little of that goes a long way.
Yeah, honestly, like we joke, but at the end of the day, organizing is all about like social connection. It's about building camaraderie and connection with your coworkers. And what better way to do that than, playing games, breaking bread, and hanging out with each other, right? So, I mean, it's a bit of a pivot maybe from the kind of social chat, but I was curious to get your thoughts maybe on the future of what you call conspicuous consumption. It's an idea that you reference in your chapter on Apple in regards to the current economic crisis, with kind of 30% unemployment potentially looming in the United States and kind of globally throughout capitalism. First, can you briefly explain what conspicuous consumption is for folks? And then, can you touch on that?
Yeah, for sure. So conspicuous consumption is one of our many goofy, interesting economics ideas. Just recognizes something that's important. There's a whole class of goods and services that people consume, not just because of their value as consumables, but because of the social signals that it sends out, So an example I like for conspicuous consumption, just because it's so goofy, is anyone who's worked in financial services or on Wall Street can tell you that when a young person, working at a financial house like, Chase Bank or Goldman Sachs or whatever, when they get promoted or when they get a big raise or a big bonus in their bonus culture there, a common thing these often young men will do is they'll go out and buy some slick ass expensive sports car, buy a Maserati or whatever young people are driving now. But of course, you work in Wall Street, you work in the center of New York, you can't drive a car in New York, let alone a flashy car where you're going to really use that premium engine. It's, you drive an inch and stop in Manhattan. People aren't buying that because that's a suitable transportation means for their position. They're buying it because they look so good in it. And when you're at the light, you can look at the girl and go, hey, look at my slick car. You want me now? That's a huge thing. If you don't think that drives consumption, you need to go back to thinking school, because of so much of what people do with their purchasing is to send signals out to others. And I mean, again, I use all of these products, goods and services myself. I'm using an Apple computer right now, but a lot of these products are for social signaling. iPhone Pro, Pro, I guess makes sense with a laptop, but a Pro phone, I'm a professional at using my phone. This is for signaling. This is for showing, oh, he's got that slick ass phone. What does he do? And however people individually react to this stuff, and whether that sounds just totally goofy or speaks to you, that's conspicuous consumption, And when you buy luxury goods, the Dior handbag and so on, if I've got that brand name correct, a lot of this is to show I am very prosperous. I'm doing very well. Maybe it's coming from a snooty place. You're like, time to show everybody what I'm made of and I'm better than them. Or maybe it's just something like, yeah, I don't mind showing off that I've done well. I've worked hard. I've earned this, however you carry it. That's what conspicuous consumption is. And so Apple's a great case because, of course, especially compared to the other firms that we talk about, they're the ones with the super expensive products, And actually, Apple has struggled about how much to pitch itself as a luxury good maker. And if you read the business press, like the Wall Street Journal and stuff, what you'll see is they've sort of struggled with it because on the one hand, luxury goods you charge more for, and they're definitely in that lane, the insanely expensive phones. And, I enjoy my Apple goods, but you can get a comparable Android phone for hundreds of dollars less than what you're paying for an equivalent, more or less, Apple product. But on the other hand, they don't want that because luxury always has, as the Wall Street Journal put it a while ago, I remember, they call it an element of exclusivity. And whenever you read luxury goods pitches for a nice vacation or a slick car or a membership at some club, it's always exclusive, exclusive, exclusive. It's an exclusive place. We don't just let any riffraff in here. And of course, that makes you feel good. Like, oh, I'm an elite. I'm, maybe a little bit better, more successful than these people. I can go in. But Apple struggles with that because they do want their product to still be a middle class, attainable product line, and they realize if they crank the prices up too high, they're going to lose more and more of those, professional or wider blue collar, middle class American consumers. So it's a line that they individually have struggled with a bit. But conspicuous consumption, I mean, that's a large part of the economy. Again, especially as our wealth and income keeps concentrating in smaller and smaller and smaller numbers of hands, smaller numbers of rich families, smaller numbers of firms with all the market share. It means there's a tiny cross-section of the society that has so much resources and so much money, it'll make you go completely bonkers. And actually, this is what my next book is going to be about, because our ruling class in the world today is so hilariously corrupt and just venal and just cheap and awful. It's pretty heinous, but most people are middle class. And you don't see that pyramid up at the top. You can't see through the clouds, So it's something that we tend to do as a sort of affectation for, see, I'm not just some middle class person, I'm a little better. you have no idea how high people are living at the top of the income distribution. Your flashy phone is not going to buy you onto the golf course with Mike Bloomberg and Donald Trump.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rob. It's interesting in this moment with the demand part of the economy being wiped out, right? So many jobs are no longer existing, and yet our economy is predicated on this conspicuous consumption. So it's sort of interesting where that is going to lead us in this moment.
The inconspicuous consumption, I guess.
Yeah, inconspicuous consumption, exactly. So, I'm wondering, and a lot of our workers are sort of interested in talking about this thing of like, what, and you bring this up in your book a lot, what role could activists in an organized movement as users and consumers of the internet, right, play in worker organizing campaigns at these firms? Is there a consumer component?
Oh, yeah. And I think that's something that we do tend to not quite recognize enough with these tech platforms is when we talk about different ideas of worker control, it's easy enough to understand that idea in the old economy. Okay, these guys are the ones going into the lithium mines, these dangerous, crazy lithium mines, so we can have tiny little batteries to make our fun devices go and never have the slightest gratitude for them. So we think, okay, well, they should have some control over what the conditions are that they work in. And like, okay, this vein is too dangerous. We're going to shore it up or we're going to refuse to work in here. Like there, it's relatively easy to understand. But with the tech platforms, it is different because, as we were saying, most of the value for these tech platforms is created by the engineers, all these supporting blue collar workers that kind of clean the platforms up for us. It's true. But we users, just as simple everyday, the billion odd users of these tech platform software, we ourselves are very meaningfully, I would argue, part of the workforce themselves. Without people making websites, there's nothing for Google search to index. Without us making video, there's no fun YouTube for them to make so much money from. We make the Facebook posts, we make the stupid tweets, we make the sexy Instagrams. Without our user content, which is not just, look how hot I am photo, like people spend so much money and energy on their YouTube channels and on their social media accounts. A lot of it is individually trivial content, but without that content, there goes the value of these platforms, So I think in a very meaningful way, we users should be thought of, at least in this sort of context, as being part of the workforce of these firms. We contribute part of the value, a significant part, in a way that we don't if you go into a Subway and buy a sandwich. You didn't do anything. You just walked in with money and tried not to make eye contact and bought a sandwich. Okay, here, we're the ones contributing and putting all of our inappropriate personal information in our posts. We're part of that workforce too. So it means it can't just be the workforce organizing, as important and indispensable as that is, and as much as a lot of us are hoping for more of it, like that won't itself get the job done. We users of these platforms, and again, I use them constantly, try not to, you just can't do it. We are ourselves going to have to be organized in one or another way, probably in different ways on different platforms, because they do such different things after all. But our organization is important too. And if Facebook users or Amazon shoppers, if we were to federate or organize on even just the loosest level, once you have, say, a couple 10,000 Amazon shoppers organized together and saying, we're not going to buy anything from you douchebags until you meet these basic conditions for COVID-19 safety in your fulfillment centers. Once you have several thousand consumers saying that, it will force even Jeff Bezos's minions to look up and pay attention to you. Again, and it's kind of too bad that it comes to this, but this just is the world of large scale business and power and production, is if you don't force power centers to make concessions, they're not going to make them. It just won't happen. Again, what Frederick Douglass said, who's popular with the president, so he must be good. The self-educated escaped slave, he said, people who want freedom without like unpleasant social struggle, you're like someone, obviously this is from memory, you're like someone who wants a tree without rain. You have to have some organization to make power centers budge. They usually, despite what you see in movies, CEOs, after all, remember, these are incorporated firms. So they have, they're publicly traded. They have investors, hedge funds and billionaires and regular people with retirement accounts. They have like Wall Street earnings targets to meet. And if they don't meet them, that's how boards throw your ass out. You might be a big time, C-suite corporate officer, But if you decide, it's really not right the way we track everyone's information all the time, or the way we bust these Amazon workers until they're exhausted and they quit after 3 weeks all the time. If you start doing that, they're going to say, why are your numbers low in your division? Get them up or we're going to replace your ass because we've got to meet this profit target or our stock price is going to fall, and that's how we're all compensated. So you can't expect these firms to make these sacrifices on our own. Like, we have to make them. And again, sometimes that's unpleasant. A lot of us aren't really like suited to doing big activism in terms of like our personal, or our personalities might not be super confrontational. Yeah, stick it to the man. But it's that, or these guys go on romping around the world with no checks on their power. And it's a pity, but that's just the way of big business and big powerful institutions. So we can, we users, we have a big role to play on this end, and we too should be thinking about how we can organize in ways, especially ways that support the organizing of the white and blue collar components of these firms' workforces. Because I might make a Facebook page about socialized Facebook. I'm not going to probably not going to get fired for that, right? You guys could totally, like, firms will threaten to take away your job and stuff, even though that is illegal. They know they can sometimes get away with it. So we should be organizing to support the workers who are organizing. And that might be something that folks watching this and using these platforms a lot should think about.
Yeah, no, that's a really great thought. And while you were talking, I pulled up the Frederick Douglass quote, just because I think it's so wonderful. And I just want people to, if you're not familiar with this, which it's very easy to maybe not be because we don't really get taught struggle in our history classes and things. But Douglass says, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. I just think that's a really, that's one of those quotes that like I return to actually fairly often, because yeah, like you said, it can be uncomfortable sometimes to organize. It can be uncomfortable to assert oneself. It's uncomfortable to go speak with your coworkers sometimes about big kind of important or controversial issues and things. But at the end of the day, like Douglas says, power concedes nothing without struggle. And like you said, these massive Titan tech companies are going to continue to kind of move around the world, causing havoc and destroying all kinds of aspects of life, and all for the sake of profit, when it could be a source of liberation. It could be a source of, alleviating a lot of the burdens of the daily life, right? Like, I think of like Google, which its, general mission is really quite noble, right? Connecting the world, making things more accessible and universal, these are good goals. And this is why like so many of my friends and peers join a company like Google to do good, to make life easier for people, to connect people who otherwise would not be able to connect. But of course, that gets lost along the way sometimes when the profit kind of motive comes in at full swing. So I know you kind of touched on it already a little bit, but given COVID-19 and all the work from home that's happening right now, we already touched on how the internet and kind of a lot of the tech resources and platforms are of extra value right now. Because everything's kind of online right now, or a lot of it is online, what role could workers in the industry play in trying to kind of move the internet towards being seen as a public utility, something that is publicly owned, publicly controlled? And we talked about worker organizing and talked about consumer organizing, but like, what tangible things do you think you have to offer to kind of people who are wanting to move in this direction?
Yeah, well, there's a number of ways to proceed. I mean, to me, and this might just be because I, work in education and that's my career. I think we look at how severe the crises are right now. We have fascist governments around the world and this giant public healthcare crisis, and we have climate change. We had 30 problems before we all got locked in our apartments, So I think people reasonably want to take steps. Like, things are out of hand. We got to do things. We take action. That's fine. That's important. But I think sometimes it's easy to get into that without thinking about how you lay the groundwork to build the popular support among the majority of people before you take those big steps, So if you want to go out and block traffic to protest the Iraq war, or these days, like our destruction of Yemen or something like that, you can do that. So that's a relatively understandable issue. Like, we shouldn't be bombing these people. And so we're blocking traffic, and yeah, we're going to mess up your workday, but people can understand why that action was taken. Even if they're personally inconvenienced or set back by that, they can at least see the issue. Here, we're looking at issues of economics and power and sneaky tracking and platform curating. It is a little bit more abstract, at least up to a point. I think, than some of these other issues are. So all I would suggest is before we do big action, you need education to come first. You need to have people broadly knowing what the issues are before you can expect them to support your action, let alone make sacrifices themselves to join the cause. Now, I think that's totally something that we can do. Like, we have a long history in this country of successful movements that overturned evil bullshit in our past, but it takes, it doesn't happen in a day. Like, Martin Luther King and the people who fought for the vote for women, like, they didn't go out and say, like, we should vote, let's go lay down on railroad tracks. They go out and do a ton of speaking and propagandizing and meeting with people one-on-one and organizing groups and just discussion forums. So people are thinking about these ideas, whether they're fully convinced or not. Then when they see the giant action, they can go, oh yeah, they do have a point, I don't know if I would go that far, but it means something to them. These issues, anything that involves economics, in my experience, people need a little bit of refreshing, at least, has been my experience from their high school economics class, before they're willing to take these kind of steps. Now, once you're willing to do that, may I suggest something that I think is very, very useful for getting people to a position where they're willing to support these kinds of organizing and action to restrain these firms or even socialize them someday, is to realize where the technology comes from. Because again, I can tell you from my personal experience around this book, as soon as people hear you're criticizing the firms, the first thing they'll do is go like, yeah, but you have an iPhone, so like, yeah, I know. We live in the social system. You aren't exempt from living in it if you don't believe in it, Like, I can't go into Best Buy and go, I don't believe in capitalism, so I'm just taking this TV. They won't go like, oh, it's good. Like, you live in the existing system. People fought to overthrow communism in Poland, but they were still wearing shoes from the communism store because that's what there is. So the first thing they'll say is that you're a hypocrite for using technology, which is dumb. But the next thing that they will say, and this I think is the real issue, is they'll say, yeah, but they invented this great technology. Yeah, but Google's easy, and I love Facebook. It's so much fun. My phone, I love my phone. I can't imagine living without it. And so they'll say, well, the firms created this technology. Like, they should have control over it. They deserve to be big and profitable because of these contributions that they made. Problem is, it's a pile of crap. If you look at the hardware in your phone, the software on the applications, and even the big firms like Google itself, they all arise, almost without exception, like one or two exceptions, they all arise from public sector research, mostly from the university system in the US and from the Pentagon and its research arms, because those are the institutions that can do long-term research. I got to tell you, my background is in the sciences personally. When you're doing fundamental basic research in any field, you never know how close you are to a breakthrough. Like, you might be learning things and feel like you're close to it, but you don't know because you're exploring something that's not known. You don't know how close you are. And you certainly don't know if you're close to something that's going to make you money, which is a whole other deal. So you can't really expect corporations and private entities that have near-term profit and earnings targets to meet. It just doesn't make sense institutionally to expect them to do fundamental basic R&D. Companies do a lot of R&D and spend money on it, but it's always the applied R&D. After the National Institutes of Health has found some compound, okay, we'll turn it into a drug that humans can tolerate. Or, okay, the Pentagon and the universities have developed this new internetwork that connects different networks. We'll call it the internet. It was developed over years in the 70s and 80s. And at times, because we have such a capitalist society in the US, like the Pentagon and the National Science Foundation, who were running the development of the early internet, they tried to get private firms to take it over, above all AT&T, of course, which was then the phone monopoly. And in chapter 8 of my book, I go through this history. They wouldn't take it. They're like, that won't make money. Maybe it'll undermine our phone business. That would be a disaster. So the internet's original name wasn't the internet. It was DARPANET. For DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration. That's the Pentagon's research arm, the military research agency. They and some of the university campuses developed the internet. Wi-Fi was developed at the University of Hawaii when all their island campuses were trying to work out a way to share access to the main computer in Honolulu. Not so easy when you can't run wires, so they developed that alternating radio frequencies system that we call Wi-Fi. And if you look even in the components of your phone, GPS, I mean, everyone knows the military developed that, but the cell signal itself comes from the Army Signaling Office, or signals. Above all, like the flashiest thing of modern smartphones is that display, the multi-touch display, which is so pretty and lets you do so many different sophisticated things just by moving your finger on it because of the capacitive sensing that it's built around, which actually, if you're interested in the details of this, it works by using your human finger's ability to conduct electricity in tiny, tiny amounts. That stuff was developed primarily by CERN, the European Particle Colliding Laboratory underground in France and Switzerland. I mean, it's a lot of detailed technical history. In my book, I just give you the short version of it. But take a look. This technology, they're delighted to take credit for it. And some of it was developed by the firms once they had the main innovation in hand from the public sector, where we've got tax money, we have the stable research conditions, you can do fundamental R&D, who knows when it'll ever make us money. Once you got something, then we privatize it. We privatized the internet in 1994. It was a very big event at the time. You can read about it. And a similar process has led to these firms all being private corporations. So in Google itself, its original web address wasn't google.com. It was google.stanford.edu, because that was the publicly funded lab where they had the steady funding environment to do it. So to me, that's something that anyone who wants to understand this sector needs to know, especially if you're trying to organize people and make them realize that there are limits to how amazingly wonderful these firms are. Again, it's science done by full-time scientists, researchers, and engineers, mostly in the public sector. Once it's ready, we'll transition to the private sector and let our engineers take it up to the consumer-facing product stage. But you're looking at individual effort, usually not even within the corporation. So then Steve Jobs and Page and Brin and so on can take credit for it. Very difficult to square that with the records. That's always something I think should be close to your tongue, because you will hear that argument very quickly.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rob. So in the interest of time, we've got some questions from the audience and people that are watching that we really want to get out there. So the first one being, are there any examples of unions at companies at this scale leveraging their position to get or at least help a campaign to nationalize a company or industry?
So companies that we're talking about supporting nationalization, did I get that?
No, I think the question really is about, like, are unions able to, are there any examples of unions being able to, leverage their position to organize these companies or nationalize an industry anywhere?
Yeah, nationalization is something that has a little bit more successful history overseas. Again, the US historically is more of a business-based society. The United States comes out of settler colonialism with the market economy. So it's not like, for example, parts of Europe and Asia that have these long thousands of years of history and other institutions that predate these tech platforms, So it's a little bit easier over there, but overseas, for sure, for years, the UK had nationalized railroads and so on. But I think an example we should look at for a couple of purposes is the NHS, the British National Health Service. Like, that wasn't made into a public universal health insurance program because powerful people wanted it. Like, that happened mainly because different activists at different levels were pushing for that. And above all, the trade union movement was like the single biggest organizing force, pushing for things like Social Security in the United States, our pension system, for the old and disabled, and for the National Health Service overseas. It's something we have more international examples of than within the US, but it's still the same basic fundamental process, and it can happen. But again, once you're looking at national policy, it's all about getting major public support, because the companies who currently run these systems will fight. It's an existential threat to them. So like Medicare for All in the United States, which Sanders and other political figures support, that's a death sentence for the health insurance industry and for much of the pharmaceutical industry too. And so these firms are going to fight to the death to avoid them. But if you have huge public support, if you get people on a mass basis to realize that this stuff is as sensible as can be, that's when you're going to be able to see those unions take those victories forward. But once we're looking at national policy, it's just much more of a national education battle, than it is, say, organizing a division of some tech company,
Yeah, and actually, there's actually a long history. I feel like we could link people to stuff, but especially in Western Europe, there's a long history of kind of unions pushing for nationalization of their companies and industries. And in the US, there's actually plenty of examples too. For instance, I believe it's in Pennsylvania, on the railway services, there were some union struggles going on at one point, and railways that had been previously privatized were taken back into public ownership because of the kind of chaos of, leaving it in private ownership. Like, it just wasn't a good fit to have railways, these, means of distribution and means of kind of transporting people around and goods around. It didn't make sense to make it run for a profit model. It made sense to run it based off of the needs of the kind of region and stuff. And so it was just this, it's an interesting little kind of historical anecdote. And, I think there's probably way more examples than any of us probably are aware of, but we should look into that. That'd be really cool.
Definitely. And rail is especially a good example because, again, rail transportation is subject to a network effect because you have a certain number of cities and spokes and sites that need to be connected. And once you have those, you've got that strong incumbent power. And as more cities connect to your rail network, your city's hub or rail yard gets more useful, has that same sort of bizarre economic pattern, completely different sort of industry. But the economic pattern of it is consistent enough that we get the same results. And maybe another example that's more US focused would be like fire departments. Up until like about 100 years ago, until the 1910s, apart from like New York City, most of your cities didn't have fire departments that the city or locality ran. You had fire brigades, which were basically private fire insurance entities. But if your house caught on fire and you hadn't paid any money to a local fire brigade or couldn't afford it, they would not put out your fire. In some cases, it's on the record, they would get into their big shiny fire truck and just drive by the fire to show people that we won't put it out unless you pay. You have to prove to the people that you're not going to put out their burning kids just because it's the right thing to do. You have to make them see that. Well, some of the people who were leading the push in the 1900s, 1910s, to make that a public thing, to, I guess, not nationalize it, but make it a public local body. Some of the people leading that were the firefighters and the firefighter unions. They were the ones who were saying, why are we letting poor people burn down? Like, this is terrible. Like, it should be a universal thing. If there's a fire and society has the ability to put out the fire and save your home and rescue your kids, we should do that even if daddy's poor and didn't pay a fire brigade for that special privilege. So we decided to, not exactly socialize that industry, because firemen, if you talk to them, they don't really run the fire departments. They're run by your various levels of city government. But we made it public, at least, the equivalent of nationalizing it. And that is, I think, a very positive example, because everyone appreciates the value of firefighting. And how different is that from fighting viruses and from public health insurance? Not that different, So when next time people argue against public services of different types, just remind them how great it is to know if your home catches on fire tonight, the fire department will try to put it out and use their equipment and be very sexy, even if you can't afford to pay them.
Yeah, Jesus. It's so clear that like a lot of services really have no business being kind of in private hands, right? They're very much public utilities, and it's almost absurd to imagine them not being, right? A case example, I think everyone's starting to realize, healthcare, right? It's obviously become very, very popular in the United States that healthcare should be nationalized and made public in some way. And there's several, unions that are, behind that effort as well, including CWA. We stand for Medicare for all and things. So that, I think, it's just an interesting example of like, this is one that's evolving right now, right?
Absolutely.
So someone has a really interesting question here, and I was wondering what your thoughts were. They say, how would you compare the economic value of the algorithm generated by the workers versus the data generated by the consumers? Is there potential for unions to hybridize the consumer that generates the data and workers that write the algorithms? Kind of, I think, bringing those communities together, I think, in interest is what they're maybe asking about.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, of course, after all, they are related, right? So again, go back to Google and it's a search function, right? It's original function. There, like, the consumer data is the whole basis for the strength of the algorithm, right? Any conventional history of Google will tell you the reason why Google searches are, to this day, like, pretty good. Like, usually, unless you're looking for something super obscure, a Google search will take you there very promptly and you move on, and we take it for granted very quickly too. But that's because of how heavily used that search engine is. You know, every time you do a Google search, every time you've ever done a Google search, I hate to tell people this, you wouldn't believe how often people are shocked by this. Any Google search you've ever done, they keep a record on. People use it like it's this idol that provides, like an oracle that just provides information and saves nothing. They've saved every search you've ever done, including the really embarrassing ones that you're thinking of right now. When I mention that, I've got them, you've got them. I don't know what you're into, but whatever is embarrassing about it, they know, just like they know it about me. All right. Well, the constant use by us of that search algorithm refines the algorithm, of course. And the best way to see that is to try for a while, if this isn't already part of your routine, in using some of the other search engines like Yahoo or Bing, Microsoft's lousy Bing, which no one has ever chosen except someone who was at work using Windows, and it launches without you picking it, right? So Bing, just because, you know, it has a significant user base just because it's packaged with stupid Windows, but it's a much more limited data pool for searches, and it shows. When you do your searches, I mean, it's, you know, it's functional, but you don't get anything like the richness and the strong relevance of the search results that we were all accustomed to from using Google and related platforms, you know. But that said, I mean, that sounds like something that would be very difficult to tease apart. That question probably could be the basis of a good PhD thesis in economics, because that's a great question. Like, for some of these different platforms, how much of this value for the firm comes from the algorithm proper versus all the data or posts or videos that the users are creating? And then plus, I mean, they are synergistic. You know, once the firm has a big platform because of an algorithm that attracts all that user data, well, then they're entrenched and they can do things like crush competitors. So I like the example of Facebook. You know, Facebook, you know, again, whatever you think about it as a platform, the better part of 2 billion users now. It's one of the most important entities in the world, you know. Well, Facebook, you can read about this in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. They have a whole body, a whole part of the company where the employees have the main job of monitoring social media and messaging startups to identify ones that might potentially in time be a threat to Facebook, or maybe take away some of its market share, or conceivably even unseat it as the dominant social platform. Although I think that's hard to imagine, it's conceivable. And they have a whole body of people who spot those firms. Once you find them, you go to them, you try to buy their intellectual property, or you threaten them, or you blackball them, or copy their work. That's the Microsoft strategy that works very well. So I remember the Wall Street Journal was reporting on this, and, you know, very neutral Wall Street Journal reportage. You know, it's business reporting. It's for investors and managers and executives and stuff. And they said Facebook is vigilant. And again, this is from memory. You can see the quote in the book. They said Facebook is vigilant for any entity that might threaten to disrupt Facebook. Which is kind of funny, because all these firms do is talk about how great it is that they disrupt our economy, and we've disrupted transportation, we've disrupted media. Great. What it tends to mean is they suck up all the revenues and money that used to be made in that sector, and now they control it. So that's a great question, though. Whoever asked that question should go to grad school, and then they can tell me.
I have a theory that they might already be someone who went to grad school just by the nature of that comment. It's an interesting one. It really is. I feel like you're right. This could be a whole book or series of books. I mean, I guess there's a guy who wrote 3 books that probably applies directly to that question. But yeah, I feel like, you know, as you were articulating it, you know, where does this value come from? You know, whether it's kind of the workers of the firms creating the algorithm, or the, you know, consumers using the data. You know, what clicked for me was it's the working class. The working class, whether it's a consumer or the producer, we're the ones generating all that value on either side of the kind of transaction in the market. So it was just something that kind of light bulb moment for me, and I thought that was kind of interesting as you were kind of talking about it. But yeah, Wes, do you want to share with the next kind of audience question?
Sure. Thanks a lot. That was really interesting. So our next question: what advantages or disadvantages do you see that tech worker cooperatives could have when competing in a similar playing field as the FANG and highly capitalized tech giants? So I guess there's sort of coming at it from the other way. Could workers, you know, create sort of alternative structures to compete in these markets?
Yeah, that's a great question. And people ask about co-ops frequently. I mean, I think co-ops are a very valid basic method for operating a firm, where the model is that the workers are going to be in charge from the beginning rather than some form of CEO or management team or whatever. And that's great. The issue there is though, of course, like these existing platforms, of course, are like full on classic market firms with Wall Street traded equities and your classic corporate governance structures, you know. So replacing those firms is something that I'm all for people trying to do. We should realize just what an uphill struggle that is just because of the economics of it. Again, once you have these networks and these platforms, they tend to really groove in, you know, people get very accustomed to using them. Changing your smartphone is very difficult if you want to go from like an Android to an Apple one. So I definitely would never discourage people who want to try to unseat these firms. I would just say you need to go in with your eyes open and realize like these firms, again, have whole bodies of people on their staff whose entire job is to make sure that no one ever does exactly what you said and disrupt them or replace them in some way. Now, that said, though, often these firms can provide like better role models like within the sector. And that's something to think about too. You know, so I tend to use, for example, Firefox when browsing, you know, for my web browser choice. That's one of the popular ones. And they have a much better record than some other firms do in terms of, you know, not tracking all of your search data and your web browsing history and stuff like that. But on the other hand, though, I'm not sure. I would be interested in hearing how much other programmers or other browser developers are paying attention to that example. I feel like in this kind of sector, what people are interested in is, you know, what's existing and what works and what makes money. And, you know, co-ops in general, I mean, on the left, where people want to have worker control of some form over different kinds of businesses, like cooperatives are a very attractive model because it's very worker governance oriented in different forms, of course. I think that's great. Just the only issue I would raise there is that remember that when we look at companies on anything like this scale, these firms employ thousands of people and have huge complex business models and do all these different lines of business. It's not going to be quite as easy as running a co-op that runs like an organic grocery store. And God bless them, I go to my organic co-op all the time. But like that works relatively well in a smaller workplace. Once they're big, you're going to need some form of representation or you know, tiers of organization where, okay, we're from this part of the business, we send our representative to the general meeting, and if they start ignoring what we say, then we can recall them or something like that. Like those are issues that I think sometimes folks who have a co-op model in mind aren't immediately anticipating. Like it is a large scale economy these days, and we need that. You know, we should realize like largeness in the economy is not itself inherently bad, you know. Without scale economies, we wouldn't have relatively cheap food, such as we do, you know, and we wouldn't have like quick YouTube load times with low latency without the gigantic investment that's required in those data centers. And across the line, down from our high-speed internet over to everything else that we do. Like bigness is important. So I'm very pro co-op organization and experiments along that line. We should just realize how entrenched the hubs are now. And the fact that one way or another, any kind of worker organization sort of scheme is going to have to deal with the bigness of these firms. And maybe they wouldn't be quite as big as they are today if we split Instagram off from Facebook. I mean, that's fine. But now we just have two separate, smaller monopolies instead of one gigantic one. So co-ops are great. It would just be a matter of reconciling that with the scale of these enterprises. And I definitely wouldn't say it can't be done, but that would be the challenge, I guess.
Right. And there's even like, you know, historical case examples of very large near monopoly corporations or oligopoly style corporations that are run and managed, like you're saying, you know, with recallable representatives and managers that are accountable to the workforce and, you know, structures that can somehow merge the kind of goals of, like you're saying, the benefits of that bigger structure with the kind of aspirations of worker democracy and control over the product. And I think of like, you know, in Spain, Mondragon is a large corporation, thousands upon thousands of employees, worker owned, and it's run on this basis, right? So it's not, you know, it's not necessarily too pie in the sky. I think the conversion is interesting. Like I wonder, you know, if that could ever be possible to convert something as massive and monstrous as a Google or an Amazon into worker management. I think that's one that's maybe like for the books, but yeah, that'd be very curious to see that. Another question we have from a question asker says, you know, what are some of the more bleak prospects of some of these companies protecting their influence and power, you know, in the coming kind of months and years of organizing? Is it useful for us to think about that now? Is it useful to think about those like potential darker moments?
Yeah, okay, these are good questions. That's interesting, especially right now when so many of us are more. America is an isolated country already, and now it's much more so with half the country under quarantine and the other half working scared. That's a great question. Like the bleak scenarios, yeah, is that a good thing to think about? Like that's a great question because that's the follow up. Like, how much should we be thinking about how bad things could be? Like, am I risking my mental health by thinking about capitalism? This is a very reasonable question to ask. And I think, of course, like we're all dealing with this crazy crisis and people are having very different experiences of it, of course, depending on the kind of work you do in the global working class. But for a lot of us, if you have free time sitting around the house with your crazy cat, I think it is sensible because it helps you to think about how bad things could get because it makes you realize like, shit, if I don't help, things are going to get very bad. Because this is America. It is, even if you're working class, and you have a very limited amount of money, you can often still afford a phone and high-speed internet. And anytime you're not at your awful job that you hate because you don't control it and the conditions are terrible, you can be entertained and you can buy cheap, bad food and get cheap entertainment and have what people in the developing world would see as like a great standard of living, and you never end up meddling or interfering with these super powerful firms and guiding us toward whatever fate we're headed toward. So it's something to consider. On the other hand, we have to think of our mental health during this crisis too. And if you're doing nothing but spinning out dark scenarios, you should, have a moment to think about something positive. Leave your apartment if you can, where you are, and get some sunshine. But as for what those scenarios are, I mean, sheesh, tech dystopia is a major TV and book genre these days, and there's lots of great examples of it. I think really what you want to do is look at what's happening now, and then you can extrapolate that into the future. What we're seeing right now at this crazy moment during the crisis, and who knows if it'll be over by the end of the summer or by next year. It's not looking great because of our incredibly inept national leadership, but put that question to the side because none of us knows the answer to that. During this time, we're seeing these firms getting more and more entrenched and us relying on them more and more. I'm afraid of what's going to happen to education if even people who people think are liberal, like Cuomo, are saying we should put the Gates Foundation and remote learning more central in the role of education. Like I can see education being increasingly privatized. Gates is leading the charge on private, charter schools where the funding is still from us taxpayers, but now the curriculum is run by Bill Gates and his wealthy donor friends. That's kind of ugly. I'd expect that kind of like fairly open class warfare to go on. Other aspects, I mean, right now, Amazon and Microsoft are fighting over who deserves to build out the next generation of the war cloud, which is a term that is really being used in industry right now. Storing all the data that the Pentagon and CIA have for overthrowing governments and blowing things up and so on. Like that's a major contest that those firms are locked in. And that is one big thing about these powerful firms is sometimes they fight. Like they fight each other, and it's not good for you or I usually when that happens. Like Rockefeller and Carnegie had this big fight in the 1800s during the Gilded Age, where Rockefeller had his huge oil monopoly fortune, and he tried to use that to buy up all the railroads so that Carnegie couldn't ship his steel, and he could force Carnegie to sell his business to him. And so Carnegie retaliated by having this railroad super hastily built so he could reach a port. It's a ridiculous story. You can read about it in history books. That's happening now. So like a simple example, Google and Amazon recently had this big spat about their smart speakers and their home assistants. For years when I was a kid, my family members and family friends would say, I don't want to tell anyone my social security number. That's how the government spies on me. But now we just have these wiretaps in our homes that sit around, and they're always on, and they're supposed to not listen except when you say their activation phrase. But of course, already early in the history of this industry, we have tons of examples where that wasn't the case, or the firms didn't fulfill their representations. And if you've ever been in a household, like I don't have these things, I have enough crazy household just by having a dumb cat. But a lot of people have these speakers in their homes. They're in half of American homes now, I read recently in the business press. So these things are always there. Well, Google got mad because Amazon, of course, has one of these with its Alexa powered speaker and the Echo Dot and so on. And Google wanted its Google Home Assistant speaker to be listed on Amazon so people could buy it there. Amazon refuses to list it. They don't want to list a competitor because they're actually power mongering scumbags like most of these firms are. And so Google said, all right, if you're not going to have our lousy privacy invading home speaker on your website, we are going to retaliate. And they retaliated by making YouTube not functional on Amazon's home speakers. So for a while, and not for like a day, for like many, I mean, this went on for a couple of months, you couldn't use YouTube or access it properly on any of Amazon's smart speakers, which for a lot of people is, a big pain in the butt. People have kids, you're trying to entertain your kid, you give them YouTube, which is itself a risky proposition. But parenting, you got to be sympathized with parents. They're always on the clock, But for a while, they couldn't get YouTube. And then they kind of worked out a deal. You still can't buy the Google apparatus on Amazon, but they made a deal. So now you can do it again. These firms fight as we rely on them more. And this, this was happening already. And this crisis now is moving us down that road. When they have their little corporate disagreements, it's going to mess our lives up more. That is a bleak future that I would anticipate. But again, we saw, last couple of years, like there are countervailing movements fighting these guys. The Sanders campaign did weirdly well, considering that it had complete opposition from the corporate world, the donor class, and all the commercial media, which after all are businesses, and they make their money selling advertising to the insurance industry and the pharmaceutical company who hate Sanders and AOC and their Medicare for all nonsense. But that movement went pretty far. And if Obama and Elizabeth Warren had taken slightly different actions, that would probably be the nominee right now. My point with that is not to relitigate this primary season, but to show there's also a lot of opposition to these firms and their power and the other ugly political currents that we have these days. And there are a number of them, So as much as I think it's, it is evilly captivating to think about the bleak, ugly scenarios we could be looking at, we should realize too that there are countervailing movements and you can contribute to them. You can organize your workforce. You can form, start smoking with your coworkers, start a Martini Tuesday or a book reading club, or organize your workforce or join the Democratic Socialists. There's a lot of stuff you can do to put yourself at least into fighting back against those ugly scenarios. So as much as you're having fun thinking about how dark things could get, don't forget too, like you could take your personal little actions and really help end up moving things in a different direction. So got to keep them both in mind, I guess.
Absolutely. And, ultimately people can and should reach out to us as well, right? And get organizing in a really comprehensive professional way. And, everything you're talking about really reminds me a lot about how, often I find myself talking to workers and they talk about the stresses or the fears or the anxieties or, all these dark things they can imagine that could come from organizing. And, I often find myself kind of just taking a moment and saying, yes, there are risks to organizing. There are real risks to organizing. But what are the risks of not organizing? What are the risks of not doing anything? What are the risks of sitting back and watching this happen in front of you? I think flipping it on its head can actually alleviate some of that stress in some way and make it a little bit more tangible, a little bit more doable, for just a single individual too. Like you said, go start meeting with coworkers in different social groups and things, right? Like the base of organizing is, little interactions, really. It's about building community. It's about, making connections with people. And I think the vast majority of people can do that. It's about empathy. Absolutely.
I mean, that's really well put. And that's true. If you're considering organizing or working to organize any kind of workplace, and certainly in tech, I mean, there's two things to keep in mind. One is that there are professionals who have experience doing this, and they can fill in a lot of those scary, mysterious blanks in your knowledge with real experience, and they can at least give you some basis for thinking about what might happen. And the other thing I would say, and I say this as someone who's been in union organizing drives in his life, at least back in the old days when I worked in retail, when you embark on any kind of political activity or organization, certainly a unionization drive or a related campaign, what management will do, and of course management, the Supreme Court has decided management has the right to sit you down one-on-one with your manager who can fire your ass, and they can tell you how terrible the union is and how it's going to mean everyone loses their jobs. They will tell you only the shitty possibilities. And you should just be at least emotionally aware that that will happen. Like, oh, you're gonna lose your job. Well, I'll be paid less. We'll probably have to close down this super profitable business because of your wanting your healthcare to have less of a gigantic deductible. Like, they will tell you the evil, again, bleakest possible scenario for organizing a union or other political activity, if Medicare for all or anything else. They're gonna say, oh, that's gonna cause this evil scenario. So you should realize you're gonna get a cartoonishly lopsided picture of what can happen there. That's where it is important to get out and get some independent views. I'm not the only one who's writing critically about Silicon Valley. There's a lot you can read about it these days. And above all, yeah, talk to some people who have experience, like people who are union organizers. I mean, at least in my experience, they will not bullshit you. Like they will tell you, like, yes, there are risks. Like these people have power. They have the power to tell you so far what your insurance will cover and won't cover. I guess that shows that they have some power over your ass. But the point here is that if you work together and start out just with simple empathy with your coworkers, talking, trying to get outside the workplace and talk, which does help a little bit with that process. Take up a smoking habit. You'll never regret it, I'm sure. But you can then really talk to people. And that I will tell you this, like once you start talking independently with people you work with, I mean, in my experience, the first thing you realize is, oh, holy shit, everyone was already thinking these things I was thinking, all alone by myself, working separately, siloed off from everyone else. You quickly realize like, oh God, we all feel the same way about this. And we have the same views. It's empowering. Like you'll find you experience like, oh, wow, we really could do this. You know, we're at least as good at this as these jack off managers who always tell us what to do and who cut our health insurance. Like you'll be surprised how much that can cut into the, like, that's what I would say is like the cure for anxiety is organizing and taking some actions and doing some education. Once you're actually active, you start to feel your individual like human agency, man. Like that's how it works. Like when you're alone and just reading about these terrible things and reading the media and going, oh God, we're all going to die. We are eventually going to die, but we could have very superior lives compared to what we do now. And you'll discover once you start working with people and just having even the smallest amount of success, what that does just for your inner and confidence and tamping down that existential dread we live with in the 21st century. A little of that goes a long way. That's what I would say.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. It's really interesting in this COVID moment. I'm talking to workers all the time that are calling us and reaching out saying, my company just laid off 30% of the people. It was a really great place to work 2 weeks ago. And now workers are taking 20%, 30% pay cuts just to stay at these firms. And, we don't know where the economic direction of this country is going to go. But what we do know is it's probably going to take those workers a long time to make up those wage increases that these companies are, exploiting and cutting in this moment of crisis, right? We talk as in organizing, you often have to create a crisis to get a company to move. Well, these firms are using this crisis as an opportunity to snatch back things that workers have already won. And in places where they don't have unions, they have no real recourse. So I guess, maybe the last question that we can leave with here are there specific big demands that organizers and activists in the industry should be making of these companies and of these firms, right? Like, we talked about the Frederick Douglass quote. Are there, and I come out of the Fight for 15 movement where we made $15 this big demand, and then we're able to win in a lot of places. So are there big demands that we should be making of these tech companies now and moving forward?
Right on. Yeah. Well, first, that's a great point in that question there. It's true. Like crisis moments, I mean, they do really tend to crystallize what's going on, but also during crisis, like that is times when there's any kind of social flux. Whatever power centers exist in a society will reliably always try to use that flux to further whatever social arrangements that they want. And this happens after 9/11 and then the finance crisis, and it's clearly happening right now. And we're seeing it in a lot of ways. A lot of these COVID stimulus packages are filled with bailouts and giveaways and just tax cuts to certain like specific real estate developers and other scumbags who have an in with the administration. So I think that's an absolutely great point, or the example that my friend Nathan Robinson likes to give is that after Hurricane Katrina destroyed New Orleans during Bush's watch, there are no public schools in the city of New Orleans now because they all got turned into charters by that scumbag administration because they used the crisis to do a conservative New Deal. And they were very open about it at the time. Now, how dare you try to put Green New Deal in this virus bailout package? It's pretty goofy. So I think that's a great point. Like what specific demands are to be taken? Like that's a good question too. I mean, right now, my God, if there's going to be a time where Medicare for all and some form of universal health care or health insurance, which is what we're talking about here, I can't imagine if there's ever going to be a good time for it, it would be now, right? I mean, right now, people are losing their jobs by the tens of millions. And all of that primary debate where Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg were saying, oh, I trust you to choose your health insurance. People love their health insurance. Well, now you're fired. So not only have you lost your job, which is already a horrible existential experience, but also your health insurance. So if you get hit by your car, your kid gets sick, or you get freaking COVID-19, you're going to be on your own to pay a hospital bill that will be $100,000, very, very, very easily if there's any hospitalization or extended treatment, you know? So that, and because like that's already such a popular thing, I mean, partially because of the Sanders campaigns and other DSA related initiatives, that now has majority public support, which is incredible when you consider the complete wall-to-wall media hostility. No national media outlet supports it because they have a business model based on selling ads. Insurance industry, pharma, hospital chains, I mean, those are some of the biggest ad buyers in America. So that would be a natural one right now. I mean, especially because not just are people losing their jobs and now their job associated health insurance, but even in healthcare, because people aren't going into doctors' clinics and doctor practices and big clinics and so on. They're closing down. They're laying off people because people are in part scared to go into those places because of the contagion environment and the administration's refusal to have a national testing strategy, which lets South Korea walk right through this crisis. We could do that. But this is a time for universal healthcare. Now, things that are relevant specifically for the platforms, I mean, that's a really interesting question. One thing I would look to for possible things that workers could demand from the platforms would be things that are being achieved elsewhere. So the European Union right now is leading the drive on regulating these gigantic trillion-dollar platforms. And so they have like the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, as I remember. And that thing is, I mean, people should look at it. I mean, even the Wikipedia page on it is a good start. And it's not bad. It leaves some things to be desired, but it means like data on you has to be stored in your country. And if you demand that a platform delete your data, they have to do it. And if you ever find out they didn't, they can go, you can take them to court. We have nothing like that in the United States. That would be an interesting thing to consider. Also over there, they're trying to tax these firms more. The rate of taxes that these firms make is cartoonishly small. It was bad enough going into this administration and the big 2017 Trump tax cut, which was actually a tax increase for a lot of us regular middle class people. It lowered their taxes on especially their overseas earnings and gave them a one-time tax holiday. It's a goddamn disgrace. And right now, we're not getting, so many people are locked down and don't have their jobs and they can't pay their second rent check as of a couple of days ago because they don't have any money coming in because they can't go to their jobs. In Canada, at least for many people in Canada, they have a UBI, Universal Basic Income, all the way through this summer so that people can pay their bills, keep the lights on, keep their internet going, feed the kids, even though we can't work right now through no fault of our own. It's a damn disease, you know? So like that would be a basic thing that we could fight for by taxing these platforms more, like taxing the platforms to pay for a UBI, a basic income so people can survive the crisis. What is a more reasonable policy than that? These firms are seriously struggling to figure out how to invest their money. They have so much after-tax earnings now. So that would be another possibility. So I'd say Medicare for all, universal income by taxing these bastards. I put that, and the General Data Protection Order, which limits your tracking and everything else and puts you in more, at least more in charge of your data. Those would be great demands. People should make those.
Absolutely. And hopefully we can be a part of making them. Awesome. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it here for night. I feel like we could probably go on all night talking about some of these subjects. I would love to, but for the sake of your own evening, I think we should probably wrap here. I just want to thank everyone who has watched over the course of the last hour and a half for tuning in and being a part of our first live stream. This is a really kind of a build a plane as you fly it kind of situation. So, we really appreciate people sticking around for it. And I also want to thank you, Rob, of course, for coming on to speak with us. Do you have anything you would like to share or say to the viewers, or where can people find your work online?
Yeah, right on. Well, I encourage people, of course, to check out the book, Bit Tyrants. Right now, it's available for half off on the publisher website. That's Haymarket Books. Just search for Haymarket, Bit Tyrants, or my name. You'll find it very quickly. Very good value for a hardcover or for a physical copy or an ebook, of course, which is also available. I'd encourage people to do that. I also am writing regularly for your quality left press. So Jacobin and Current Affairs has kind of become my publishing home. I just had an article recently on Affairs looking at the tech companies and how they're trying to be on their best behavior during this crisis. So when you usually go to YouTube and it's all stuff you've clicked on and sexy content they want to show you. Right now it has the CDC videos up on the front of it. Boring, reliable Centers for Disease Control. They're trying to not embarrass themselves like they did in 2016 and in the past, but they're still firing organizers and collecting all your data and helping the Pentagon blow people up. So they're sleazy as ever, but they're kind of trying to polish their reputations and using the crisis as a chance to do that. So that might be a good place to check out. We also have a great current affairs video channel where we talk about a lot of this stuff. I have some videos there myself talking about tech